From the USS Oriskany to the Fujikawa Maru, let's dive into the most incredible sunken wrecks of all time. The USS Oriskany. Named after the Battle of Oriskany fought during America's War for Independence, the USS Oriskany was initially planned to be a long-hulled Essex-class ship, but her construction was halted in 1946 as the war drew to a close. Essex-class ships were the most common aircraft carriers used by the American military during World War II, and after the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Oriskany became one of the first ships in this class to get an upgraded design. Her schematics were reworked over the next 4 years to facilitate new fighter jets, providing a blueprint for 14 more upgraded Essex-class aircraft carriers later on. Measuring in at a sprawling 888 feet in length and powered by 4 steam turbines, the USS Oriskany was one of the most impressive aircraft carriers of her era. She departed on her maiden voyage on December 6, 1950, traveling from New York to Florida to test out her capabilities. And once she qualified as a viable aircraft carrier, the USS Oriskany became a vital resource for both the Navy and the Air Force for several decades. However, in 1966, the Oriskany was in the Gulf of Tonkin near Vietnam when disaster struck. A seaman inadvertently set off a magnesium parachute flare on her starboard side, leading to a massive explosion that cost the lives of 44 men. The ever-resilient Oriskany underwent extensive repairs and returned to the Pacific, providing extensive support for the military during both the Korean and Vietnam Wars. After earning 12 battle stars for her service, she was eventually decommissioned in 1976. Nearly 3 decades later, in 2004, the retired aircraft carrier was taken to Florida, where she was slowly transformed into an artificial reef. On May 17, 2006, the USS Oriskany was sunk with controlled detonations that sent her drifting to the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. Her ghostly wreck has now become a hub for wreck divers who often find themselves in awe of its sheer size. The Endurance. In the early 20th century, Antarctica was completely uncharted territory, and the quest to uncover the secrets of this mysterious land resulted in the British Empire investing in several expeditions to the frigid continent. The Endurance was one of the last ships to set sail in this age of exploration. Built in 1912, the Endurance was carefully designed to withstand sub-zero temperatures with oak walls twice as thick as regular vessels. It's safe to say that she was one of the most durable ships of her time, but she had one fatal flaw: she didn't have a bold bottom. This meant that she'd be unable to resist the inward pressure of ice if she ever got frozen in place. And that's just what happened when Ernst Shackleton took her on her maiden voyage. About a year after departing from Plymouth, England, she became trapped in pack ice near Antarctica and was eventually crushed by the pressure 10 months later. Her wreckage was eventually found in 2022, nearly 10,000 feet below the surface of the Weddell Sea. Despite the damage done to her hull, her deck, helm, and various other parts are still intact, serving as a chilling reminder of just how dangerous Antarctica can be. The Mary Rose. The Mary Rose was one of the fastest and most powerful ships in Henry VIII's Navy, providing significant firepower for 33 years during the war between England and France. With over 80 guns aboard, the Mary Rose was designed specifically for combat, going on to sink countless enemy ships after she was launched in 1511. Most sailing ships built until then were multifunctional vessels, but the Mary Rose was arguably one of the first ever purpose-built warships that used sails instead of oars. Her design included several innovative features, such as the presence of broadside cannons that could deliver a devastating explosive barrage in the blink of an eye. However, even a ship as powerful as the Mary Rose can't last forever. She was sunk during an intense naval battle in 1545, and for over 400 years, she lay at the bottom of the sea somewhere near Portsmouth, England. A team of wreck divers stumbled across her wreck in 1971, sparking a frenzied attempt to raise her out of the water. Over 10 years later, in 1982, the Mary Rose was hauled back onto land, surrounded by a carefully constructed salvage cage in one of the most expensive maritime recovery projects in history. She's now on display at the Mary Rose Museum, which receives millions of visitors every year. The RMS Titanic. The RMS Titanic is arguably the most famous ship in the world. The tale of the Titanic was immortalized by the epic James Cameron film, but amid all the Hollywood blockbuster spectacle, you might forget that she was a real ship with real passengers, thousands of whom died at her unfortunate collision with an iceberg. One of the most shocking scenes in the movie was when the ship split in two. But this little fact was completely unknown until the wreckage was discovered in 1985. This is when Jean-Louis Michel and Robert Ballard finally discovered the Titanic's shattered remains and noticed that it had broken in two halves, which lay a third of a mile apart in the underwater chasm now known as Titanic Canyon. Her final resting place also happened to be 13 miles away from the coordinates given by her radio operators right before she plunged into the depths. What's interesting is that the rear section of the ship was more or less intact, even though the front section was destroyed beyond recognition. That might be due to the force of the iceberg, which crumbled the bow but didn't have much of an impact on the stern. Ever since the Titanic's wreck was discovered, she's attracted scientists, treasure hunters, and tourists from all around the world. However, her iron and steel hull is rapidly deteriorating in the salty water, and it might not be long before she disappears forever. Would you ever visit the surreal wreck of the Titanic? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe while you're at it. SM-UB-85. The SM-UB-85 German submarine saw action in World War I, but she didn't last very long. She met a disastrous end at the hands of a mysterious creature. She carried more than her fair share of weaponry, including 10 torpedoes and a 3.5-inch deck gun, a crew of nearly 36 men operating her at any given time, but that wasn't enough to save the submarine in the end. On April 30th, 1918, just 5 months after she was commissioned, SM-UB-85 was found by a British coastal patrol ship near Belfast, and oddly enough, her hatch was partially open and water had flooded through. The British ship began firing, forcing the crew to abandon the submarine and surrender to the enemy, after which the submarine was sunk. However, when the captain was interrogated, he told a bizarrely terrifying story about why the submarine was in such a bad way. According to him, SM-UB-85 had surfaced the previous night to recharge when a massive unknown sea creature began to viciously attack her. The size of this creature must have been enormous, since the submarine was over 180 feet long. Other members of the crew reported firing at it with their handguns, and though the creature eventually stopped its attack, the damage was already done. The submarine wasn't able to submerge anymore after that, which likely resulted in it being found the very next day. This tale has become a part of naval folklore because in 2016, marine engineers scouting an undersea power cable route discovered her intact remains off the coast of Scotland. The submarine looked to be in near-perfect condition, which might cast some doubts on the sea monster story. Whatever the case may be, this eerie submarine wreck is a well-preserved relic of the past, one that could provide some answers about what truly happened the day she fell into the depths forever. Queen Anne's Revenge. The notorious pirate Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, sailed on board a stolen French frigate that was initially called La Concorde, but which he renamed Queen Anne's Revenge. This was first mentioned in the written record around 1710, and most experts believe that this was when she was built. After spending some years as a slave ship, she was captured by Blackbeard in 1717, who added more heavy artillery to her arsenal and made her the flagship of his fleet. With this powerful vessel under his command, Blackbeard traveled from the West African coast to the Caribbean, plundering numerous British, Dutch, and French vessels in the process. In June of 1718, Blackbeard was trying to escape into North Carolina when his ship ran aground, forcing him to leave her behind. He surrendered not long after that and accepted a pardon from the governor, and while he did return to piracy and eventually lost his life in combat, his former ship was nowhere to be seen. The location of Queen Anne's Revenge was shrouded in mystery for centuries, until a private firm called Interstal Inc. found her wreckage in Beaufort Inlet near North Carolina in 1966. Over the years, archaeologists have uncovered numerous historical finds from the sunken wreck, including 31 cannons, which is far more than a ship her size usually has. What's more, the ship contained advanced medical equipment for that age, which indicates that Blackbeard used cutting-edge medical science to take care of his crew. The Vasa. When King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden wanted to expand his territory into Poland in the 17th century, he commissioned a ship with the sole intent to dominate the seas. This led to the creation of Vasa, a juggernaut of a ship that took 2 years to build. But ironically enough, she barely traveled 400 feet from Stockholm before a sudden gust of wind made her take on water and ultimately caused her to sink. This was an extremely embarrassing moment for the king, since the sinking was witnessed not just by thousands of ordinary Swedes, but also foreign dignitaries and diplomats. No one knows why the pride of the Swedish Navy couldn't last 20 minutes on the open water, and after her precious bronze cannons were recovered 30 years later, she fell into obscurity. She spent the next 333 years decomposing just over 100 feet beneath the sea. But in 1956, the Swedish archaeologist Anders Franzen found her once again after an exhaustive search. Much like the Mary Rose, Vasa had to be brought back up with extreme caution to avoid damaging her. She turned out to be exceptionally well preserved, down to the ornate carvings on her hull, since up to the 20th century, the waters near Stockholm were too toxic for microorganisms that would have broken down the wood. The SS Thistlegorm. The SS Thistlegorm was launched in 1940, but she embarked on what would be her final voyage just a year after she took to the sea. A British steamship built to aid the war effort, the Thistlegorm completed 3 trips to America, Argentina, and the West Indies, carrying thousands of tons of cargo, along with ammunition to fend off potential air attacks. However, when she departed from Glasgow on her ill-fated journey to Alexandria in 1941, she encountered a foe that continues to haunt ships to this very day, the Suez Canal. A collision forced her captain to drop anchor, but while they waited for help to arrive, German intelligence operatives in the region got word of an incoming Allied vessel and dispatched bombers to take her to a watery grave. Around 1:30 a.m. on October 6, 1941, 5 metric tons of high explosives were dropped on the Thistlegorm from above, causing her to sink along with 9 members of her crew. She crashed to the bottom of the Red Sea, where her wreck was eventually discovered by French naval officer and oceanographer Jacques Cousteau. The enormous collection of relics and artifacts she holds has made her wreck site a popular destination for recreational divers, some of whom have come across entire bomber tailplanes and armored vehicles that she was bringing to Egypt. Fujikawa Maru. The 450-foot-long vessel, Fujikawa Maru, was built by Mitsubishi in 1938. Although she didn't serve in her original capacity as a cargo vessel for long. When the Japanese Empire became a major player in World War II, its navy needed as many ships as it could find, even if those weren't capable of firing at the enemy. As a result, the Fujikawa Maru was requisitioned by the Imperial Navy in 1940, where her ability to transport refrigerated cargo was ignored in favor of how many soldiers she could fit within her hulls. This once humble vessel ended up taking part in the Battle of Midway, one of the most devastating naval conflicts of the entire war, and a consequence of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. She somehow survived this fight, but over the years she experienced continuous bombardment from American forces. After being struck repeatedly by torpedoes in 1943, the Fujikawa Maru's time on the sea finally ended during Operation Hailstone. She sank at around 7:15 a.m. on February 18, 1944, but she wasn't forgotten for long. Scuba divers flocked to the Chuk Lagoon where she now rests, her metallic carcass completely covered in coral and surrounded by vibrant marine life. In a way, she almost looks as though she belongs in the deep, calm blue, seeming more like a natural feature of the lagoon than a man-made object, which might explain why scuba divers can't seem to get enough of her. The MS Mediterranean Sky. Initially called the MS City of York when it was built in 1953, the MS Mediterranean Sky, 540 feet long, was a passenger liner that was purchased in 1971. It was bought by a cruise operator who converted her into a ferry and gave her the name we know her by today. She spent over 25 years traveling from London to Cape Town and everywhere in between, but by 1996, she was ready to retire. Her final voyage began in Italy and ended in Patras, Greece, where she lay decommissioned for years. Eventually, she was taken to shallower waters nearby, where she was turned on her side and partially sank in 2003. She's now one of the most interesting shipwrecks in the world, with her capsized profile cutting a desolate but striking image in the blue waters of Greece. Do you know of any other amazing shipwrecks you'd like us to make a video about? Let us know down below in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.